somewhere on the grasslands of Mongolia in the spring of 1206, a man who had spent his life as one of the most hunted individuals in Central Asia stood before an assembly of clan leaders who had spent decades trying to kill him and was declared their supreme ruler. He had been enslaved as a boy. He had watched his father be poisoned. He had been hunted across the steppe by rival clans who wanted him dead before he could grow into a threat. And in 1206, at an assembly called a Kurultai, the man-born Temujin was given the title Genghis Khan, and within 20 years, he had built the largest contiguous land empire that has ever existed on the surface of the earth. Within 70 years, his descendants ruled from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Vienna. The textbooks will tell you this empire's history, a spectacular, terrifying, world-altering chapter that began in 1206 and ended, depending on which successor state you count, somewhere between the 14th and the 17th century, when the Khanates fragmented, converted, assimilated, and were absorbed into the empires and nations that came after them. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368. The Golden Horde dissolved over centuries into the Russian and Central Asian states that replaced it. The last formal Mongol Khanate, the Khanate of Bukhara's nominal successors, lost any meaningful connection to the original line by the 18th century. For most of the last 400 years, the standard account of the Mongol Empire has treated it the way history treats every empire. It rose, it conquered, it ruled, and then it ended, leaving behind monuments, language fragments, and a permanent place in the historical record as something that used to exist. Then in 2003, a team of geneticists published a study that did not fit inside that framework at all. They had been sampling Y-chromosome DNA from 16 populations across a stretch of Asia running from northeastern China through Mongolia, Central Asia, and into parts of Russia and beyond, and embedded inside that data was a pattern that should not have been possible. A single genetic lineage, a Y-chromosome signature so specific and so recently formed that its carriers must all share a common male line ancestor who lived within the last 1,000 years, was present at a frequency that, when extrapolated across the full population of the regions where it appeared, corresponded to roughly 16 million living men. Almost 1 in every 200 men on the planet, at the time of the study's publication, carried the genetic signature of a single individual, whose dates and whose geography pointed, with a precision that the researchers themselves seemed almost reluctant to state plainly, at one specific person. The empire was not history. The empire never actually ended. It just stopped being political and started being biological, and it has been quietly expanding for 800 years inside the bodies of people who have absolutely no idea they're carrying it. To understand what the DNA revealed, you have to first understand 2 things that have nothing to do with genetics at all. The first is how the Mongol Empire actually worked as a reproductive system, which is a sentence that sounds strange until you read what the historical sources themselves say about it. And the second is how the Y chromosome behaves differently from every other piece of DNA in the human body, which is the reason this particular finding was even detectable in the first place. The Mongol Empire, at its territorial peak under Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai and his cousins ruling the western Khanates, covered approximately 24 million square kilometers, an area larger than Africa, stretching in an unbroken band of Mongol-administered territory from the Sea of Japan to the Black Sea. No empire before or since has controlled a contiguous landmass of that size. The Roman Empire, at its height, covered roughly 5 million square kilometers. The British Empire, at its largest extent, covered more total area but was scattered across oceans, with vast distances of water separating its territories. The Mongol Empire was one continuous block of land administered, taxed, and garrisoned by a ruling structure that radiated outward from a single founding family. That family is known to history as the Borjigin clan, and within it, the direct male line descendants of Genghis Khan held a status that the historical sources describe with remarkable consistency across multiple independent traditions. The Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongolian language text, and the Jami al-Tawarik, the Persian universal history compiled under Mongol patronage in the early 14th century, both describe a social and political order in which descent from Genghis Khan through the male line, a lineage referred to as the Altan Urug, the Golden Family, conferred a hereditary right to rule that was treated as categorically different from any other form of nobility. Only members of the Golden Family could legitimately hold the title of Khan anywhere in the Mongol world. This was not a courtesy title. It was the foundational legal principle of the entire imperial system, recognized from the Yuan court in Beijing to the Ilkhanate in Persia to the Golden Horde on the Russian steppe. What made this principle so consequential in purely demographic terms was how it interacted with the reproductive practices of the Mongol elite. The historical sources are explicit and largely unembarrassed about this. Mongol Khans and senior nobles maintained large numbers of wives and concubines, a practice that was not considered scandalous within Mongol society, but was instead a visible marker of status, integrated into diplomacy through marriage alliances with the ruling families of conquered territories, and documented in administrative records that tracked the household sizes of senior nobility because those households were themselves units of political and military organization. Genghis Khan himself is recorded as having had at least several primary wives and a substantial number of concubines, and his sons and grandsons, ruling as Khans across the territories the empire controlled, replicated this pattern at every level of the Golden Family across multiple generations. The mathematical consequence of this arrangement, sustained across roughly 4 centuries during which the Golden Family held privileged status somewhere in Asia, even as individual Khanidates rose and fell, is a reproductive advantage operating at a scale that has essentially no parallel anywhere else in recorded history. A single founding male, whose direct male line descendants for generations afterward occupied positions that conferred both the legal right and the practical means to father unusually large numbers of children, sitting at the apex of a political system that spanned a continent and lasted for centuries. This is where the second piece of background becomes essential, because without it, the scale of what the DNA found is almost impossible to interpret correctly. Most of the DNA in the human body does not work the way people assume when they hear about ancestry. The autosomal DNA, the 22 pairs of chromosomes that carry the vast majority of the human genome, is reshuffled every generation. A child receives half their autosomal DNA from each parent, but which half is essentially random, a process called recombination that scrambles the genetic contributions of all 4 grandparents, all 8 great-grandparents, and so on, doubling the number of ancestors, and having each ancestor's specific contribution with every generation that passes. By 30 generations back, roughly the distance separating a person alive today from someone who lived 800 years ago, the theoretical genetic contribution of any single ancestor to the autosomal genome is on the order of 1 part in a billion. In practical terms, it is statistically undetectable. This is why the dilution of royal bloodlines over centuries is not a metaphor. It is a mathematical certainty built into the mechanism of inheritance itself. A king's genetic legacy, in the autosomal sense, evaporates within a few hundred years, regardless of how many children he had. The Y-chromosome does not work this way. The Y-chromosome is passed from father to son, essentially unchanged except for the slow accumulation of mutations, generation after generation, without recombination. A man's Y-chromosome is, with minor mutational differences, the same Y-chromosome his father carried, and his father's father, and so on back through an unbroken male line for as far as that line extends. The Y-chromosome does not dilute. It does not get halved. It is either passed on intact to a son, or it ends with a man who has no sons, in which case that specific lineage simply terminates. There is no intermediate outcome. Every other piece of an ancestor's genome fades into statistical noise within a few centuries. The Y chromosome either survives completely, carried by every male line descendant down to the present day, or it does not survive at all. This is the mechanism that made the 2003 finding possible, and it is also the mechanism that explains why nothing about it shows up if you look at the wrong kind of DNA. A man living today who carries this lineage would show, in his autosomal genome, essentially nothing detectable connecting him to a specific individual who lived 800 years ago. But his Y chromosome, the one piece of his genome that travels down an unbroken male line without dilution, can preserve a signal from that individual with a clarity that the rest of his genome cannot match. The Mongol legacy is not spread thin across the whole genome of 16 million people. It is concentrated, intact, and traceable, sitting on a single chromosome that each of those 16 million men inherited from his father in an unbroken chain stretching back 800 years. The 2003 study, led by Tatiana Zergel and a team working primarily out of Oxford, was not originally designed to look for Genghis Khan. It was part of a broader effort to map Y chromosome diversity across Asian populations, sampling more than 2,000 individuals from 16 populations, spanning a vast geographic range from the Amur River Basin in northeastern China and Russia, through Mongolia and Inner Mongolia into Uzbekistan, and across other regions of Central Asia that had, at various points, formed part of the Mongol successor states. The researchers were looking for population structure, for the broad patterns of relatedness that Y chromosome data typically reveals about how populations have moved, mixed, and diverged over thousands of years. What they found instead, embedded inside several of these populations, at frequencies that ranged from a few percent up to as high as roughly a third of all men sampled in some specific populations, was something that the standard tools of population genetics describe using a specific term, a star cluster. A star cluster is the genetic signature of an extremely rapid population expansion from a very small number of founding lineages, sometimes just one. It gets its name from the shape it produces when the relationships between individual samples are mapped. A small number of closely related haplotypes radiating outward from a central point like the points of a star, with very few of the mutational differences that would normally accumulate between lineages that had been diverging for a long time. A star cluster is the genetic equivalent of a population explosion frozen in time, the molecular evidence of a moment when one lineage suddenly began producing vastly more descendants than the lineages around it. The researchers used the accumulated mutations within the cluster to estimate its age, a technique that relies on the slow, roughly clock-like rate at which the Y-chromosome accumulates small changes over generations. The estimate they produced placed the most recent common ancestor of this entire cluster at somewhere around 1,000 years ago, with the statistical range comfortably including the lifetime of Genghis Khan, who lived from approximately 1162 to 1227. The geographic distribution was the detail that turned a statistical anomaly into something that demanded explanation. The cluster was not evenly distributed across Asia in the way you would expect from a lineage that had simply been present in the region for a long time and slowly diffused outward through normal population movement. It was concentrated at its highest frequencies in populations whose territories corresponded closely to regions that had been directly administered by Mongol successor states for extended periods. Populations in Mongolia itself, in regions of China that had been incorporated into the Yuan dynasty, and in parts of Central Asia that had fallen under the Chagatai Khanate, and related successor states all showed elevated frequencies of the cluster, while populations outside these historical boundaries, even ones geographically close, showed dramatically lower frequencies, or none at all. The combination of a recent common ancestor, a frequency high enough to require an extraordinary explanation, and a geographic distribution that mapped onto the political boundaries of a specific historical empire was, to the researchers, difficult to interpret any other way. They proposed, with appropriate scientific caution, that the most likely explanation was social selection, operating through the reproductive advantages conferred on the male line descendants of a single founder whose lineage subsequently held privileged status across a territory matching the distribution of the cluster. They did not have, and could not have had, a genetic sample from Genghis Khan himself to confirm a direct match, because his burial site has never been found. Mongol tradition held that Genghis Khan's grave should remain hidden forever, and despite extensive searches using everything from historical records to satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar, the location of his remains remains unknown more than 700 years after his death. There is no skeleton to sequence. There may never be one. What there is, instead, is an inference, but an inference built from a convergence of independent lines of evidence that point in the same direction with enough consistency that subsequent research has continued to treat the connection to Genghis Khan and the Golden family as the most parsimonious explanation available, while maintaining the appropriate caveat that the cluster represents the lineage of the founding patriline of the Mongol imperial system broadly, which Genghis Khan himself stood at the head of, rather than a literal confirmed match to his specific remains. The distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about it. What the DNA confirms beyond reasonable dispute is that a single male lineage, dated to the correct period and distributed across exactly the territories that the historical record says were controlled by the descendants of one founding family for centuries, expanded to a scale that has left it present in roughly 16 million men alive today. What remains technically unconfirmed, because it cannot be confirmed without a sample that does not exist, is the literal genetic identity of the founder himself. The empire's reproductive footprint is not in dispute. The name on the founder's gravestone, because there is no gravestone, is the one piece of the puzzle that may never close completely. This caveat does not weaken the story. If anything, it deepens it, because the alternative interpretations all point to the same place. If the founder of this lineage was not Genghis Khan personally, the most likely candidates are his father, Yasuge, or one of Genghis Khan's own sons, all of whom were themselves members of the same patriline, and all of whom occupied positions within the same system of hereditary privilege that the historical sources describe. The lineage belongs to the Golden family. Whether the specific individual at its root was Temujin himself, or one of the men whose blood ran in the same line immediately before or after him, changes very little about what the finding means for the 16 million people who carry it today. They are, in the most literal biological sense available, the patrilineal descendants of the ruling dynasty of the largest land empire in human history. The scale of 16 million deserves to be sat with for a moment, because it is easy to read past a number like that without absorbing what it actually represents. 16 million is larger than the population of most countries on Earth. It is more people than live in the entire nation of Greece or Portugal or Austria. It is roughly the population of the Netherlands. And it is not 16 million people in some abstract statistical sense, scattered thinly and invisibly across the whole world. It is 16 million men, concentrated heavily across a specific band of Asia, walking around right now, going to work, raising families, living lives with no connection to Mongolia or to medieval history in any way they are aware of, each one of them carrying, on a single chromosome inside every cell of their body, an unbroken molecular thread connecting them to a man who was crowned on the Mongolian steppe in 1206. The mechanism by which this happened did not require the Mongol Empire itself to survive. This is the detail that makes the story genuinely strange, rather than simply impressive. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368. The Mongol rulers were driven out of China by the Ming. By any conventional historical measure, Mongol political power in China ended in the 14th century. But the genetic expansion of the Golden family's lineage did not require Mongol political power to continue in any specific location. It required only that, somewhere across the vast territory the empire had once controlled, descendants of the Golden family continued to occupy positions, whether as local nobility, as leaders of successor conaties, or simply as a hereditary elite whose status persisted long after the empire that had created that status had fragmented, that gave them reproductive advantages over the surrounding population. And the historical record shows exactly this. Descendants of Genghis Khan continued to claim and in many cases hold elite status across Central Asia for centuries after the political unity of the empire had dissolved. The title of Khan itself in numerous Central Asian polities remained legally restricted to descendants of the Golden family well into the early modern period, in some regions until the 19th century. The empire, as a single political entity, lasted at most a few centuries. The privileged reproductive status of its founding family's male line persisted for roughly twice that long, expanding the lineage long after the maps had been redrawn, the capitals had changed hands, and the empire itself had become something people studied rather than something people lived inside. This is not a unique phenomenon in the broader genetic literature, and the comparative cases help illustrate just how specific and how extreme the Mongol example actually is. A separate and much smaller star cluster has been identified in the male population of Ireland and parts of Britain, traced through historical and genealogical evidence to Niall of the Nine Hostages, a semi-legendary High King of Ireland traditionally dated to the late 4th or early 5th century AD, whose descendants founded the Uí-Néill dynasty that dominated Irish politics for the better part of a millennium. Estimates of the modern descendant population for this lineage run into the low millions, concentrated in Ireland, Scotland, and among diaspora populations descended from them. The mechanism is structurally identical to the Mongol case, a founding figure whose male line descendants occupied hereditary positions of elevated status for centuries, producing a measurable expansion of a single Y-chromosome lineage that persists today in people with no awareness of the connection. But the scale is different by an order of magnitude. The Uí-Néill dynasty controlled a portion of one island for a few centuries. The Golden family's reproductive privilege operated across a continent for the better part of half a millennium. The Niall lineage produced a few million descendants. The Mongol lineage produced 16 million. And that figure was calculated using data from 2003. Population growth across Asia in the 2 decades since means the actual number of living men carrying this lineage today is almost certainly higher, quite possibly significantly so. The geographic specificity of where this lineage is concentrated tells its own story about how empire and biology intersect. The population sampled in the original study with the highest frequencies of the cluster were not, for the most part, in Mongolia itself, where the Mongol population had always been relatively small, and where the cluster's frequency, while elevated, was not the highest recorded. The highest frequencies were found in populations along the periphery of the historical empire's territory, in regions that had been incorporated into Mongol successor states as conquered provinces, administered by a Mongol-descended elite ruling over a much larger local population. In these regions, a relatively small number of men carrying the lineage, occupying positions of authority over populations that vastly outnumbered them, produced a proportionally enormous genetic impact because their reproductive advantage was being measured against a denominator of millions of local subjects rather than against the relatively small total population of ethnic Mongols. The empire's genetic footprint is largest precisely where its political footprint was most disproportionate, where the smallest ruling group exercised authority over the largest subject populations. Conquest, in this very specific and very literal sense, left its deepest biological mark not at its center, but at the edges of what it controlled. There is a further layer to this story that the original 2003 study could only gesture toward, but that subsequent research, using larger sample sizes and improved dating methods, has continued to refine. The star cluster, identified in the Asian data, is not the only one of its kind that has been found in connection with the broader history of steppe empires. Other, smaller clusters with similarly recent common ancestors and similarly suggestive geographic distributions have been identified in populations associated with other historical dynasties and ruling lineages across Eurasia, suggesting that the mechanism the Mongol case demonstrates so dramatically, hereditary elite status translating into a measurable expansion of a single Y-chromosome lineage, may be a more general feature of how steppe and post-steppe political systems shaped the genetic landscape of Asia than the Mongol case alone would suggest. The Mongol lineage is simply, by a very wide margin, the largest and most clearly documented example of a pattern that may have played out, at smaller scales, many times across the history of the Eurasian Empire. What none of this changes is the experience, or rather the complete absence of experience, of the 16 million men who carry this lineage today. There is no ceremony. There is no document. There is no family story passed down across 800 years and 30 generations that says your ancestor was the founder of an empire that once stretched from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. The lineage persists entirely outside of cultural memory, carried forward not because anyone remembered to carry it, but because it is physically incapable of not being carried forward, passed from father to son the way it has been passed from father to son since 1206, indifferent to whether anyone along the way knew or cared what they were passing on. A man in rural Inner Mongolia, a man in Uzbekistan, a man whose family has lived in the same valley in Central Asia for as many generations as anyone can remember, going about an ordinary day, carries inside every cell of his body the unbroken biological signature of a political project that reshaped the entire continent of Asia and is, by every measure historians use, long since over. The framing here matters, in the same way it has mattered in every story this channel has told about ancient lineages persisting into the present, and it is worth being precise about it one final time. This is not a claim that 16 million people today are, in some meaningful cultural or personal sense, Mongol, or that they share any trait, characteristic, or inheritance beyond the literal molecular fact of a shared patriline. The Y chromosome carries genes, but the specific lineage identified in this research is defined by a set of markers used for ancestry tracing, not by any known functional trait that would make its carriers different from anyone else in any way that matters to how they live their lives. What is being inherited is ancestry, a record of who fathered whom, traced along a single line, stretching back to a man or men who lived at the founding of an empire. It is not destiny. It is not character. It is not a hidden royal claim waiting to be asserted. It is a fact about lineage, sitting quietly inside the cells of millions of ordinary people, true regardless of whether anyone ever knows it, true regardless of whether it means anything to them at all. And yet it is difficult, even with all of that said, to avoid the strangeness of what the finding actually represents. Every other empire this channel has examined left its mark through institutions, through languages, through cultural practices that persisted because people consciously maintained them, taught them to their children, carried them forward as deliberate acts of memory and choice. The Roman legions left descendants who knew they were Italian. The Norse berserkers left descendants who knew they were Norwegian. The transmission in those cases was cultural as much as it was biological, even if the people involved did not know the specific historical details of how they came to be where they were. The Mongol case is different in a way that none of the others quite are. The transmission here required no culture, no memory, no institution at all. It required only biology and time and the specific historical conditions that allowed one man's male line descendants to occupy positions of privilege across a continent for long enough that the ordinary rules of genetic dilution simply did not apply to them in the way they apply to everyone else. Return to the steppe. 1206. The assembly of clan leaders, the declaration, the man who had been hunted as a boy, now standing as the supreme ruler of a confederation that was about to become something the world had never seen before. He could not have known what he was setting in motion in any sense beyond the political and military campaigns he was about to launch. He could not have known that the empire, his sons and grandsons, would build across the largest contiguous landmass ever controlled by a single political system would, within 2 centuries, fragment into successor states, and that those successor states would, within a few more centuries, themselves dissolve into the larger empires and nations that followed. He could not have known that by every measure historians would use, his empire would become, within 500 or 600 years of his death, a closed chapter, something studied in books, something visited in museums, something that existed. He also could not have known that none of that would matter in the end to the question of whether his line continued. The empire could fall, the Khanates could fragment, the Golden Family's political privileges could erode century by century until nothing remained of the legal structures that had once made descent from this man a categorical marker of the right to rule anywhere in Asia. All of that could happen, and did happen, and the lineage kept expanding anyway, because by the time any of it happened, the expansion no longer needed the empire to continue. It only needed what it had already been given: centuries of head start and a piece of DNA that does not dilute. The textbooks said the Mongol Empire ended. The Y-chromosome says the expansion never stopped. It just stopped needing an empire to keep going. 16 million men, and counting, are walking proof that the most successful conquest in human history did not end when the conquering stopped. It simply became invisible, folded into the ordinary biology of millions of families across a continent, indistinguishable from anyone else, indifferent to borders that have been redrawn a dozen times since, persisting the only way anything from 800 years ago can persist into a body that exists today. Not as memory, not as culture, not as a story anyone tells, just as an unbroken line, father to son, all the way back to a man crowned on a grassland who never imagined that the part of him that would last the longest would be the part that left no name behind it all.